So I'm Lindsey. I'm the Executive Director for South Valley Services, known as SPS. I'm going to be speaking specifically about our shelter that's located in Salt Lake County, but a lot of my remarks are reflective of the experience of all domestic violence service providers around the state. So it's an honor to be able to speak in representation of victim services today, so thank you guys for inviting me. Our Salt Lake shelter is the second highest utilized shelter in the state, so this funding has substantial impact on our organization, on our ability to be responsive to victim needs. The state funding, stable funding that we receive, it's our most critical resource for ensuring victim safety. This foundation funding keeps our doors open, and it makes sure that we can address the many safety and trauma barriers survivors face. Additionally, however, when awareness efforts are successful, demand increases, making prior year budgets no longer sufficient to meet the growing needs we see year after year. Please don't misunderstand. Seeing an increase in requests for services is actually a really good thing because we know how silenced survivors are with fear and isolation, making the rate of domestic abuse heavily underreported. The challenge we encounter with this increase as service providers is keeping up with the need, especially as our law enforcement partners are referring more survivors and as more survivors are courageously reaching out for help. For instance, when the lethality assessment protocol became mandatory for all law enforcement agencies to use, our referrals at SPS doubled within the first 6 months and have maintained steady the past 2 years. But SPS is not alone. Other community-based shelters around the state have also experienced substantial increases, which led to one-time funding we received to help us respond to the demand. That funding is set to expire in June, which will amount to a substantial decrease in our budget while demand for services remains high. To illustrate the impact of losing this funding, if not renewed, I'd like to share a few examples of exactly what this means to the survivors and families we serve. The first example, and the most fundamental example, is advocate wages. The amount that our Salt Lake shelter received for this one-time funding funds 3 full-time advocate positions. Without these 3 advocates, our shelter would lose coverage for 14 shifts every week, the equivalent of 2 shifts per day. With the 56-bed shelter, we require 2 resident advocates on every shift 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to support the families we house, in addition to the dozens of hotline callers we assist by phone every day. This means a survivor in crisis is waiting until the advocate is available to take their call. This could be a survivor who finally built up the courage to call for the first time, to be let down if unanswered, and possibly too discouraged to call again. Or it could be a law enforcement officer calling while on scene to connect a victim to services from a high danger lap screen, which just simply can't wait. But even if the advocate prioritizes all incoming calls over everything else during their shift, other needs must go unmet, and those residing in shelter are left waiting for the support they need and deserve. Other examples include critical operational expenses like communications and security monitoring. But those expenses are ongoing, not just one time. For instance, if the cameras at our gate go out, we have to repair or replace them immediately, or we can't identify who approaches our access points of our property. Or if our property lighting isn't adequately maintained, safety can be compromised, which is a priority for housing a vulnerable population, not a luxury. Without reliable phone and internet service and equipment, hotline calls and urgent calls from law enforcement won't get through. And without cell phones, survivors can't text us when it isn't safe for them to call. And if we don't have computers and software licensing and an electronic database in our budget, we can't securely store information about our clients, information which is we are required to protect at the highest level of confidentiality for victim safety. These funds are also used for things like clinical services. We at SPS provide support groups that help reduce wait times so survivors can access trauma recovery counseling. Our counseling services help survivors learn about trauma and its role on their day-to-day functioning, teaches coping skills, helps survivors regain control of their lives as they reinforce their rights to safety, peace, and dignity. These services are essential to helping break cycles of abuse for survivors and their children. Regardless of what combination of expenses this funding covers for any of our different programs around the state, We can't afford to cut any of these expenses, none of them, especially being that we are already not keeping up with the growing demand. Every month, we turn away dozens of callers requesting shelter due to capacity limitations. In January alone, we turned away 56 eligible survivors, not counting the children in tow. That was just at our Salt Lake County shelter, because the need exceeded our bed capacity every single night. Last year, we turned away more than 430 eligible callers due to capacity, and so far this fiscal year, our unmet requests have been trending more than 50% higher than last year's numbers. I want to be clear, it's not about our program suffering when resources are lacking. This is about victims suffering. When programs are underfunded or inaccessible, they are who are hurt at the end of the day. So I urge the legislature to make sure the DCFS Victim Services budget request is funded. It directly supports victim safety, so survivors have a place to turn to in their time of greatest need. Thank you.